So now we're going to go on to this piece of horror movie heaven called Tales of Terror, which is so many great things in one. Obviously, it's another Poe adaptation by Roger Corman starring Vincent Price. But not only that, but it's technically four adaptations, and they're done in the style of one of my favorite sort of corners of horror, which is the anthology. So just everything about this already lines up to be something amazing. And I think for the most part, it pretty much delivers on that. And so the first thing before we even get into those is this like William Castle-esque opening with the beating heart, where Price is kind of addressing the audience and addressing like our heartbeats in this particular moment as we're starting up, and the terror that's about to sort of wash over us with this movie. Already, just everything is off to a really great start. And then we open with a very, very loose adaptation of Morella. Morella being this very sort of eerie, romantic tragedy sort of a story. And here we're just going to kind of go full-blown horror with it, which is perfectly fine. Again, like all the other adaptations we talked about, it starts with somebody coming through the fog and through some twisted woods up to a big scary-looking castle of sorts, or a big house, with like wind as the background noise. And just everything is that wonderful, creepy, foggy vibe that so many of these 60 horror movies of this era perfected. And we watch the daughter come in, and of course everything is covered in cobwebs. The table is absolutely covered in it. It's like it looks like an actual cake of cobwebs. And it's fantastic. And then we get the meeting between her and her father, our first Vincent Price character, without the mustache, which is a little jarring. And this very sort of, not so much combative relationship, but he's obviously very resentful and blames her for the death of his wife, Morella, because we get this very sinister moment after they've had this sort of father-daughter spat, and then they go their separate ways. And Price addresses a portrait of Morella on the wall and says, "Your murderer has returned." And there's just something about that right away. If you don't know the story, especially going into it, or how they're going to change the story, so you kind of don't know anyway, it's this very sort of mysterious, intriguing, what happened, who are these people, and where's this going feeling, just right away. And just right away it pulls you in. And then we get these really unexpected moments, like the fact that he went and got Morella from her coffin and has been keeping her body for decades. And I especially love, I learned recently that when we see Morella's corpse, that's actually a matte painting, rather than somebody physically there, or like a dummy physically there, or anything under makeup, which is insane. And I miss this from like movies of this era. It's like there's so many things from this older era. It's like, you know, if we brought that back, even though it was used because that was basically their means at the time, I think movies would get a lot better again. And then we get these moments where the daughter mentions that she has some sort of unidentified illness of sorts. She's dying, and we don't really go into that. But it does seem to bring them a little closer, and it makes natural sense that if anything's going to bring anybody closer in this particular story we've set up, it's more death. So, in this very sort of ironic way. And then we get a little bit of backstory of what supposedly happened to Morella, where he's explaining that they were at a party, and that great moment where like the party music starts to fade in, and it's almost like we flash back without flashing back, which is a really great way to do that, because flashbacks, especially as we've seen in previous Corman movies, can be done really well. But it's also something that can be a bit overused, so when you see a little tweak like that where it's like, we're kind of doing that, but also not really, that's just really exciting to me. Then we get this whole setup of Morella's objective is essentially to avenge herself. And there's just something really creepy about thinking about... And once again, we're not actually seeing the flashback, so this is the mental image in our head as he's telling us. But we see it very vividly that in her dying moments, instead of like, you know, fear or sadness or whatever, it's rage. And it's rage that she's going to avenge what's happened to her and come back in some way. And then sure enough, we get this freaky scene where this apparition is moving through the house. Sometimes it feels like point of view shots. Most of the time, we're actually seeing it. And I think that's another one of those things where it's like, sometimes you would think showing less equals more, but then there's also cases where it's like, you kind of expect them to show less, so when they do actually show more and you actually do see a ghost going through the halls, it's quite unexpected and freaky in the moment, which is really fantastic. And then as we get into this, where the ghost goes in and the daughter dies and then vanishes, and then Morella rises again, it's like there's just a whole head-spinning series of events that happens here. And it's interesting to me that I struggled to say the story as it's told in this adaptation is ambiguous, but there's a lot of things that are not being explicitly said about what's going on here. To take a story that is a really great story and a very entrancing story, but like I said, is like this sort of romantic, eerie tragedy of sorts. So to take that and make what this is going on here, this really sinister shit, is really fun to see. So that's our first segment. Then we go into territory that is still dark, but there's also a sort of lighter quality to it. There's another Price movie called The Comedy of Terrors, and I get a lot of vibes of that movie when I see this segment, and vice versa. So this one is this very skillful merging of the Black Cat and the Cask of Amontillado, with Peter Lorre playing the Montresor character, the one that hates Fortunato and wants to do away with him. But we start off with Lorre being the main character of the Black Cat, where he has the wife and she has the cat, and he can't stand the cat. And it's like, just right away, before we even go into anything else, this is one of those things, when you see Peter Lorre raging at that cat, and it feels just like the story you've read so many times out of a Poe book. And it's like, this is one of those things that you just like have to stop and be grateful for that it exists. It's like, there's like an alternate universe where this movie didn't happen, and you're thinking of like these old horror movies and these old adaptations, and you would say like, you know what would be amazing is if they had put Peter Lorre in the Black Cat, but we actually live in the universe where that movie exists, and that makes me really happy. So, going into that, and he is obviously, you know, the super angry drunk. They also throw in that interesting detail where he hallucinates these different sort of threatening animals of sorts, or animals that kind of can get under your skin just at the sight of them. It's mainly snakes. And the way that comes back later as he's more and more losing his mind was a really interesting choice that I'm kind of glad they threw in. And I love the fact that he quite literally seems to drunk stumble from the Black Cat into the Cask of Amontillado as he goes into this bar, and Fortunato is there, who is again Vincent Price, who now has his mustache back, but it's also great because it's such a contrast to the Morella segment, where now he's like super animated and he's super expressive, and it's like a full-blown comedic performance from Price. And in so many different ways, because not only does he have like the exaggerated expressions and like the comedic timing and all that, but it's especially hilarious when you look at it as this is how Price approached it, knowing that the story is that Montresor absolutely despises Fortunato, just hates every single thing about him. So the more over the top he is and the more expressive he is, the funnier it is. You can tell like Price is like having so much fun doing that and just leaning farther and farther into that, just making him as hateable as possible, at least from the eyes of Montresor. But the thing about it is, what would make it even more funny is that in the story, The Cask of Amontillado, the hatred that comes for Fortunato from Montresor is so petty from where it's coming from. So it's like, I kind of prefer when this whole story transpires for, like, the pettiest reason. But when you're looking at it as it's also an adaptation of The Black Cat, so he is eventually going to kill his wife at some point too, I suppose it does make sense to make it the affair thing, where his wife has an affair with Fortunato, and then he comes for both of them, and so we get the ending of The Black Cat and The Cask of Amontillado at the same time. So, like, as far as adapting those two together, it makes sense to do the whole affair thing, but I do also think it's, I guess it could have added much more to the black comedy of it, if it was for just as petty of a reason as it is in the story. And so, but we still get, you know, those comedic moments. Like, even when he's luring Fortunato back into the house, and he invites him in, he has to invite him in 3 times, and Fortunato just keeps saying thank you. Just like a little random comedic moment like that. Really, it's even his poisoning is comedic. The way he realizes what's happening and then passes out. It's like, it's such an interesting approach to take to this, and it just works so well. And I guess it's also just the juxtaposition after the Morella segment, where it seems like it could be jarring, but I think after the Morella segment, it was kind of needed. And the fact that in the anthology setup, you can do something like that. You can jump that much from one vibe to another, and from one tone to another. So I really appreciate how they really leaned into the dark comedy for this one, and the way Laurie and Price play off each other doesn't even need to be explained. It was always something that was going to be perfect, and it is still, and continues to be after all these decades still. Now, as far as, like, getting into our final moments, we talked about how, you know, it's basically a convergence of the end of The Black Cat and The Cask of Amontillado, but there's this sequence that happens beforehand, where, what I was alluding to before, where he does start to lose his mind completely in this sort of drunken stupor, and he's having all these hallucinations, and the picture, like, squeezes, and then we see them come out of the wall and attack him. And then we get this really wild and bizarre sequence. And I guess, imagine being an audience in the early 60s seeing this. I'm not sure how much exactly they could get away with, but in this hallucination or it's a dream sequence, when they decapitate him and toss his head around while his headless body is chasing after them, and it's insane. It's fucking insane. And I appreciate it going to that level. Like, this is, I really, really love this segment of the movie. I remember I saw this at a pretty young age, before I saw it again later in life, and in the time in between, this was the segment I definitely remembered the most vividly. Actually, it may have been one of the only things I remembered about the movie, was this whole segment, and particularly this final, like, last 5 minutes or so of this particular segment. Everything here should have added up into something this amazing, and thankfully it did. So then the final segment is an adaptation of The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Voldemort, and this one is also one that takes liberties, for sure, particularly with the Basil Rathbone character, and making him like the villain of the piece, in much more in a way than he was before, but in a way that actually does make sense. With, you know, whenever you have, like, it's sort of he's like a hypnotist, but he's like the mad scientist character that plays God, and that messes with his brain a little too much, is essentially what the character becomes, and having that sort of power over life, what it becomes. And it's, for the most part, the story we know, and a lot of the dialogue that we know from the story, and the way they do the hypnosis scenes also with the colors and stuff like that. And it does feel like the use of the different colors and the spinning colors does kind of foreshadow the next story and adaptation that we're going to talk about. I've talked before about how we were in, like, this sort of psychedelic era with the 60s, obviously, and that sort of imagery was really coming into the movies at that point. And the fact that the premise involves hypnosis is pretty much the perfect way to sort of bring that in and show the imagery in that particular way. But as far as, you know, the setup to the story of the suspending someone in death as they're dying, and it's like, there's so much of Poe that has like this consistent fear of death in it, or this confrontation of death in it. And then it seems like to just naturally come in this story of experimenting with death itself, and then what the horrible consequences of that are. And so, and being trapped in it as a concept is just terrifying. And to have this horrific setup like this, it's very easy to turn this into a terrifying story when you have the concept of the mind living on while the body is dead and still being able to vaguely communicate. And the way we see, like, you know, the decay start to happen, and his echoing voice is like this sort of, it's like a living ghost is in there. And as it gets worse and worse, the longer the time goes on, and I think they say it's like months. I can't remember how long it is in the story, but it's an obscene amount of time, enough time to get to the conclusion that we come to. And this is when the movie takes a really big swing, because again, we're doing the anthology, and we've had the 3 different segments, and so you're going to want to end with a bang. You're going to want to go out big for your grand finale. And so, while it is this really horrific moment in the story when they snap Voldemort out of it, and he just very quickly just decomposes into a puddle of putrid nothingness, is one payoff in itself. But of course, this is a movie from this era. How are you going to really shock audiences here? The idea of having him get up zombified as this is happening, as he's melting, and attack who our antagonist is with Basil Rathbone, it is a pretty fantastic way to go out, and a pretty fantastic way to use what was already in the story and say, well, what if we took this up a notch? And to have him actually moving around like a zombie while that's happening, the scary thing from the story is happening, is a pretty great way to say, why don't we do just one more thing to push this a little farther to end the movie on a big note. And that's what I feel like they accomplished here. So, yeah, obviously, I've always been a really big fan of this movie, because I really just love the horror anthology in general, but like I said, when you have all the elements in here of Vincent Price and Peter Lorre and Corman, and just the whole 60s horror vibe that they were perfecting as they went, just everything, and the combining of the stories and throwing in their own elements and stuff like that, it's all, everything, all the elements are really working together to make a movie that's just really fun, especially perfect for horror fans, especially horror of this era. So I think that's where I want to end this. So once again, if you're following along, you probably know what the next thing is. For the short stories, like I said, the poems will be in their own video, but that'll be what this is, and then we'll continue to do all the other stuff we've been doing, and hopefully people have been having fun with that. So that's where we'll leave this. So until the next thing, I think that's it.